All right, welcome everybody to the University of Atlanta's winter session online. We've got a slightly international audience today, which is also very awesome to see. I am also going to hit captions. So I'm going to enable the closed captioning. So hopefully you guys will be able to see that. If not, you may have to hit it on your end. Anyway, welcome to the University of Atlantia. My name is Magistra Beatriz Alvarez de la Hoya, and I am from the Barony of Highland Ford in the Kingdom of Atlantia, so Western Maryland. For our overseas audience, I'm about an hour northwest of the city of Washington, D.C. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Catalan style from 1300 to 1500. And the precursor to this is part of an ongoing project between myself, my apprentice Mariana, and one of my colleagues in LOCAC, Duchess Constancia, to try to categorize Spanish fashion a little more effectively than it has been in the past. If you do anything with Spanish fashion, you know that the English-speaking Bible for Spanish clothing is Ruth Matilda Anderson's Hispanic Costume, 1480 to 1530. And while it is absolutely wonderful, doing some Spanish language comparison between her work and the original from Carmen Bernis has shown that there are quite a bit of issues with translations and sort of a failure to very well categorize styles by region. So that is a project that we're working on, and that is something that I'm attempting to do today. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of Catalonia and a little bit about Catalan art, some major painters that you want to know, and then we'll look at a few of what I've been able to pick at as particularly uniquely Catalan. All right, so this is the plan. Of course, we'll talk about Catalonia first, and then we'll look at some sources in Catalan art. We'll talk about the birth of the concept of fashion, the draper, tailor, seamstress business in Catalonia, and then we'll talk about some specific styles, the hopa or hopalanda, bias cut plaid, the verdugado, and what I refer to as short, tight, and pointy. So first, let's look at Catalan. So that you get an idea of the region that I'm looking at, Principality of Catalonia is up in that northeastern corner of Spain. It is frequently absorbed into the Kingdom of Aragon in our period. And so it often appears and disappears. There is a debate currently among a lot of Spanish and Iberian reenactors about whether or not we should be properly talking about Catalunya, or the Kingdom of Aragon as a whole. And I'm going to stick to the Catalan language right now, both to recognize their current push for independence and also so that more of the viewers recognize the region that I'm talking about. But we could really use these interchangeably, and quite often the Kingdom of Valencia also gets folded into Aragon, so some of these influences sort of creep around the region. Okay, so a short history of Catalonia. Of course, in 718, the landmass of Iberia was conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate, and Catalonia becomes what will become Catalonia was then part of Al-Andalus. Then in 760 to 801, Iberia was conquered by the Frankish Empire. So that region where Catalonia and Aragon are formed what become known as the Gothic and Hispanic marches, which is like a buffer zone that ran across that upper corner of Iberia between the Frankish Empire in Europe and the Moorish caliphates in Iberia. And they basically served as like the Welsh border marches for that region. So from 801 to 988, they were ruled entirely by Frankish vassals, the Counts of Barcelona. In the late 9th century, one of these counts of Barcelona actually founded the House of Barcelona. His name was Wilfrid the Hairy, and he was a Frank. And that is the origins of the city of Barcelona. So in 1117 is the record that is the earliest known use of the word Catalonia for the independent counties of Barcelona. 1137, the Count of Barcelona, Count Ramon Berenguer IV, married Queen Petronilla of Aragon, and they created what's known as a composite monarchy, where they are each independently rulers of their own nation, and instead of one absorbing into the other, they tend to rule side by side of independent countries. You will see this quite frequently through Iberian history. Probably the most famous example is Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile ruling over Castile and Aragon. Okay, moving on into the 13th century, in 1258, James I of Aragon, who was the Count of Barcelona, the King of Majorca, and the King of Valencia, renounced his hereditary rights to all of his domain in Occitania and recognized Louis IX of Occitania as heir to the Carolingian dynasty. This was called the Treaty of Corbeil. So a lot of rulership of France and Occitania relied on the potential ruler's recognition as part of the Carolingian dynasty. Iberia has very much the same tradition in that the kings of Castile and Aragon trace their right to rule back to the Visigoths. And likewise, Occitania and France does the same thing to the Carolingians. So basically, at this moment, James of Aragon is recognizing Louis IX's right to rule that territory. And in exchange, Louis releases all of his claims, his conquest claims, over the counties of Catalonia. And Aragon formally recognizes Catalonian independence for the first time. So from 1164 to 1410, which overlaps this time period, Aragon goes through an enormous expansion territory. This is pushing back against the Moorish occupation. So the Christian kingdoms are pushing down from the north of Spain and gradually shoving the Moorish caliphates all the way down to Granada, which is where they stick and cling. So in that time period, Aragon adds to its own territory the kingdom of Valencia, the kingdom of Majorca, Sardinia, the kingdom of Sicily, and the duchies of Athens and Neopatris. So they've expanded across the Mediterranean at this point. And eventually, Aragon becomes a maritime trade force that rivals Genoa and Venice on the Mediterranean. Then in 1283, the Cortes Catalanes were formed, and the Cortes are the different parliamentary bodies that exist across the Iberian Peninsula. The Cortes Catalanes, the Catalonian parliament, is one of the first parliamentary bodies in Western Europe, so it's one of the oldest parliaments we have. And this helped Catalonia maintain its independence and its sort of character as its own nation. Now, unfortunately, as in much of the rest of Europe, from 1347 to 1597 is when the Black Death really hit Iberia and hit it hard. 37% of the Catalonian population died. At one point, the King of Aragon and the King of Castile both died. King Martin I, who was the very last member of the House of Barcelona, died with no heirs. I'm sorry, let me click that back. And because he died without an heir, here's a familiar name, Ferdinand Trastamara, Ferdinand I of Aragon, becomes king of the Kingdom of Aragon. So Aragon maintains control over Catalonia, not entirely uncontested and not very happily until 1462, when the Catalan Civil War breaks out. And between 1462 and 1486, you have a civil war called the War of the Rementhas, where it's basically a peasant uprising. It's a serf or rementha rebellion against feudal abuses of the Kingdom of Aragon against Catalonia. So they were trying to take back the independence that they had had. They end up failing, unfortunately. In 1469, Ferdinand II of Aragon marries Isabella I of Castile. So Castile and Aragon remain separate as a composite monarchy, but Aragon retains possession of Catalonia. Then in 1516, Charles I becomes the King of Castile and Aragon, and you would know Charles as the Holy Roman Emperor. He retains his grip on the Catalan Republic, and in fact, moving briefly past SCA time period, from 1640 to 1659, Iberia experiences the Reapers' War, which results in a brief independent Catalan Republic, which is almost immediately taken back over in the War of Spanish Succession. So the Catalans basically had another uprising, and in 1714, they ended up surrendering to Philip V of Bourbon, who merged Catalonia into Castile. And then Catalonia remained a property of the Kingdom of Castile, the region of Castile, until effectively the present day. And you'll see a lot of discussion in the 20th century and now in the 21st about independence for Catalonia. So they are still attempting to become an independent nation. Now, that's a very brief overview. There are some excellent histories of Catalonia out there that go much more in depth than I did, but I wanted to give you some grounding in the era. So let's look at some sources in Catalan art, because realistically, working with Iberian sources, you end up using a lot of art. So what you're mostly going to find between the 13th and 15th century in Spain is some variant of Gothic art. There's Catalan Gothic, which was a specific artistic style that existed in the Crown of Aragon from the 13th and 15th century. So it overlaps European Gothic and the Renaissance period, and it's often largely applied to architecture, although now it's being applied almost equally to art and to painting and sculpture. But the real feature is that it's confined to Barcelona and anywhere where Barcelona had its sphere of influence. So places like Mallorca. It was a very small artistic movement. And it bleeds into and kind of falls under the umbrella of International Gothic, which is much better known. This existed from the 14th to the 15th century. It's what we all recognize as Gothic art. It's an artistic style that began in Burgundy, in France, and Northern Italy, and then spread across Western Europe. So, when you think of things like David and, the beautiful high French painting, that's really that International Gothic style. So the important figures in Catalan art are Ferrer and Arnau Bassa, who are a father and son painter pair. Information about them is very sketchy. They both died in the same year. I haven't been able to find out why. If I had to hazard a guess from the time period, it may have been the Black Plague. Then Luis Barraza, who lived from 1360 to 1426. Juan Dauer, who was active from 1358 to 1374. Ramon d'Estaurant, who was active in the mid-14th century. And then the Serra house. So all four of these are brothers. Jaume, Pere, Francesc, and Juan Serra were a set of brothers, all of whom were artists, but Jaume and Pere are much better known and much easier to find works by them. But if you're wanting to dig up the really famous Catalan painters, this is a good place to start. So Catalan fashion, most of what I'm looking at and using that term fashion, really falls into a time period where the whole concept of fashion is being invented in Europe. So from 1300 to 1350, you see this immense expansion of textile and clothing technologies. So, the ability to produce specialized fabric, to put together advanced garments really begins to explode in the first half of the 14th century. And this leads to the birth of something called fashion, by which most of the research authors that I read mean sartorial innovation. So real innovative practices in the creation of clothing. This is the first time that you see real trends in clothing. You see people wanting to emulate other people's fashion. So there's this widespread social awareness of new fabrics and apparel styles. It's not just restricted to the urban elite or a particular noble class. Like people throughout become aware of brand new technologies and fabrics and brand new clothing styles. And you have basically the beginnings of a commercialized consumerist economy. And as we know now, consumerism equals emulation and the desire to differentiate yourself from others. So you both conflictingly want to be like your peers or your betters and be an individual. And then, of course, also, you get that all of the side effects of commercialized economy as well. Okay, so and the biggest feature of that is specialization in industry. So as the economy becomes more and more dependent on industry and commercial activity, you get these individual industries which are specializing. Now, I'm summing all of this up very quickly and just touching on the high points. The development of fashion and textile industries and the commercialization and industrialization of society. There are thousands of books that are written on this topic. So just trying to give you a really brief taste. And of course, the development of a fashion economy leads to specialized jobs within that economy. So drapers, tailors, and seamstresses. The fabric trade in Catalonia, and now we'll start to focus specifically on Catalonia and not on the greater of Europe or Spain, really starts to pick up from the 12th to the 14th century, where this range of fabrics that were available expands enormously, very significantly. So as early as 1230, there are records from the city market in Vichy about merchants importing fabric from as far away as Bruges, Arras, and Saint-Omer, and they were primarily for female garments. There is a great article. I will actually put up a list of sources on my website as soon as I can. That's basically like textile consumption and wedding trousseaux in the kingdom of Catalonia from 1300 to 1500. That's really fascinating to read through. And then by 1300, you could purchase fabrics from as far away as Champagne and Paris and Saint-Denis. You could buy all of that right there in Catalonia. They did not have to go abroad for it. And as this textile purchasing industry picks up, you start to develop a textile and garment retail, which is different from cloth merchants and warehouses and just sort of a general retail business. So we're starting to specialize now. Drapers were really the first step of this specialization. In the 13th century, drapers were basically the people who sold uncut fabric that they purchased from cloth merchants. So the cloth merchants would trade back and forth overseas. So a Catalan cloth merchant might travel to Bruges, pick up a load of probably wool or silk at the time and bring it back, and then sell it in Barcelona to a draper who would then sell it to a customer who would then take it to a tailor. So that's basically the chain of events that happens to a bolt of cloth. Drapers were first mentioned in records around Barcelona, and most of the information that I'm getting is from records of drapers because these folks were incredible record keeper for a reason that we'll get to very soon. Now, originally, drapers would limit their range. So they had sort of a sales territory, and it would be very close to where they lived. So they might cover a whole village, they might cover their local city, or several of them might expand out to cover a larger region within Catalonia or Aragon. And pretty much those expansion patterns then replicated in Valencia, which is immediately south of Catalonia and Aragon. So they sort of, established their territory. They might work together with a network, but they tended to stay pretty much where they were, and just more drapers would pop up in other areas. So in the 14th century, you see this phenomenon start where drapers are starting to sell via market stalls or through their own independent workshops called operatoria that they would own themselves. And the reason that their records are so good is that the drapers were some of the first people to use credit extensively. They extended credit to their customers and they took credit from the cloth merchants. So it becomes a very delicate balance of, you have to get paid for that fabric so you can pay your supplier. And another result of that, like a side result, is that the legal system becomes very invested in making sure that fabric and textile debts are paid off in time, because very quickly the majority of Barcelona's economy starts to rest on textile, fabric, and garment industries. So the only way that you know that you're going to get your money back is if you keep really good records. So that's why we still have drapers records back to the 13th century. Now, by the end of the 14th century, there were so many drapers in the Kingdom of Aragon that nearly every household in the region, rural and urban, was able to make trade with a draper. There were local drapers in every little spot, either independent or working in networks. So this becomes an enormous industry very quickly. And once you have drapers, then you need tailors. And the tailor's job was to take uncut cloth that the customer purchased from a draper and then turn it into finished garments. And for the most part, these were men, but not always, and we'll talk about this. So in addition to turning out brand new garments, tailors also mended garments and then remade clothing. So they would tear them apart and take the fabric, recover the fabric, and make a new style out of it, which also helps to explain why there's not really a huge amount of textiles in Europe in general and in Iberia if you're remaking over your clothing over and over. And sometimes these tailors would overlap with drapers. So a tailor might decide he would make extra money by selling his own cloth as well. So then you get this sort of one-stop shop where the draper, who is the tailor, buys everything from the cloth merchant and then sells it to his customers, who then use him to make their clothes. So it's a great way to expand your business without getting into dangerous territories of new industries. And then by the end of the 14th century, like I said, you see tailors that are common at most levels of society. They're reaching everybody. They can get to everyone, much like the drapers. They're using a lot of credit as well, and they're reaching every household. So cities might have, 50, 60, 100 tailors working within them. And when we're looking at things like Catalonian markets within cities, there would be one little space in the market that was all drapers booths, and then one little space that might be all tailors booths. So you literally would walk the market and pick everything up and do all of your shopping within one spot. Now, I fell down a little rabbit hole reading about royal tailors as well. In the 14th century, James III of Majorca, which was within the Catalonian sphere, and Pedro III of Aragon both issued ordinances, so state ordinances, that described all of the offices of their courts. And amongst each of these were descriptions of what the royal tailor did and what his responsibility was. And it's super interesting because the description is that an appointed tailor would be at court permanently, whose main duty would be to make the king's clothes in a secluded space hidden from the curiosity of others. So the tailor worked in secret. He didn't go home, he lived at court, he made the king's clothes, but no one could see the king's clothes until he wore them. And this really helped to cement the king's position as like the arbiter of fashion. So he always is coming out with something surprising and new that then everybody wants to copy. So the tailor would be responsible for purchasing all the cloth and all of the embellishments. He would have to manage the wardrobe budget and all of the expenses. He also managed all the expenses for the royal seamstress, who was not allowed to handle money. He was expected every year to create new suits of clothes for all the annual royal festivities, which equaled out to about 16 complete outfits per year for the king. And then he was required to swear and maintain an oath of secrecy and loyalty to the king, for which giving away any of these sartorial secrets could mean death. So we have some serious royal business fashion going on here. Now, I mentioned that women were primarily seamstresses, which in Catalonia, this was their primary occupation in the fashion industry, and it usually meant that they worked with linens and undergarments. So sometimes that meant specifically linen clothing, and sometimes it meant camisas and chemises and underwear, etc., for both men and women. And they also mended and remade clothing. The royal seamstress was not allowed to handle money, so she would not be responsible for her budget. She reported directly to the royal tailor. But otherwise, seamstresses were independent artisans. They might work with a tailor, but they handled their own everything. Women they were also allowed to be tailors, especially as this fashion boom happens. And suddenly you have areas where the demand for tailors far outstrips the supplies. So women would be allowed to become tailors with no resistance whatsoever. And in fact, in the city of Vich, there was an entire family who every member, including all of the women, were tailors by trade and trained tailors. Other areas that you would see the men with fashion trades would be, creating embellishments. There were borserias, which were purse productions. They were responsible for knitting or weaving the little alms purses that people carried. They could be weavers, and they were also tailors' apprentices to female masters. But they didn't necessarily end up becoming a master, but the ones that did would take their own students and have their own shops. So now that we've gotten through the sort of industrial background and a little bit of history, let's look at some of these fashions, because I did promise you some weird clothes. And the first one that I want to look at, it's one of my favorite, is the hopa or the hopalanda. And if you're spotting that very much like English, it is a houppelande. Yes, in fact, and we think they may have gotten their inspiration from France for a lot of these styles. So the houppelande looks like this, and it's a basic houppelande. But the thing that really sets it apart from Western European houppelandes is the collar. And you have to really look at the scale of some of these collars. If you look at the woman in the upper left in pink, the collar is as tall as her head. Likewise with the woman in red. So these were basically houppelans as we know them. They would have been made in heavier fabrics. So these are basically intended to be warmth layer garments. This is what you would put on over your gown if you were going to be in, say, a cold hall or somewhere outdoors or at a really festive occasion. Most of the records that we have from them show that the houppelanden were in like a heavy plush wool or silk brocades or cut velvets, excuse me, or embroidered velvets. So very rich fabrics. They were often lined in wool or fur. They would be extremely heavy. So this is not really something that you're wearing inside your own home for relaxation. And my theory on these collars is that they're cut mostly of a piece, like we see with shorter doublet collars, but then would probably be stiffened on the inside with some sort of paste buckram to get them to stand up that high. But they also range down to these very small, if you look on the far right, the woman with it's more of a like an integrated mandarin collar. You do also see hopas with the square necklines or rounded necklines, but I really wanted to focus on the weirdest ones right now. And I have a couple of others that also get a little excessive. You can see the gentleman in the red on the far left. Everybody's going, oh no, I don't remember what for, because I don't remember what painting it is, but something terrible has happened. But you can see the fur edge of his hopa up under his chin. And then in the center, probably the goofiest looking St. Catherine of Alexandria in the entire world. This is Luis Borrasca, by the way. He's sort of infamous for cross-eyeing all of his saints and angels. She's wearing the hopa with a very deep V neck, but it has the standing collar open around her face. And you can see she has the enormous sleeves, which you can barely see in the full size picture. And then she's also wearing a wrap over this that is the pink material lined in fur. So her hopalanda is blue, and then she's wearing a pink wrap over that. And then to the far right, you can see both the more modest standing collar, and then to the immediate right of that center figure, you can see one of the dresses with the low square neck. And that brocade is particularly nice because you can see her turned back sleeves are dagged in shapes. So it looks very much like the styles that you're going to see in Europe at the same time, with the exception of that enormous collar. You can even see in the woman in the brocade, she's lifted her skirt for walking, and you can see her underdress underneath it. Okay, let me go on. And here's a couple more of my favorite extreme hopalanda on the left, where there's a queen wearing one with a collar that's actually taller than her head. It goes up as high as her crown, so you know that she is very important. Pretty much all of these are what would be very expensive fabrics. I mean, this is a conspicuous consumption item in which you want to use as much of the most expensive fabric as you possibly can, so that everybody knows that you're wealthy, basically. The center one, probably also very excessive, but I saw somebody in chat mention those collars look like they'd be super warm. Don't they just? Wouldn't that be great for today to have a big collar lined in fur? If you're in the mid-Atlantic US, it's about 25 degrees where I am right now, and windy as anything, and it would be fantastic. And then to the far right, it's a little hard to make out. The photo I got it from is a little grainy, but she's got that enormous collar. And you can notice that even though she's bent over with her head bowed praying, that collar is standing up behind her. And it is completely fur lined. This is part of my argument for them being warmth layer or outdoor layers, is because if that thing is entirely layered in fur, it must be like walking with a carpet wrapped around your body. And I can't imagine that you would want to wear that indoors where it might be warm. So if you want a Spanish project to really show off some excessive consumption and some, signature Spanish craziness, go with this. They also got really insane with the headwear that went with it. These are all garments, by the way, that I've picked out because people in different classes have pointed out that they are only present or largely present in Catalonian paintings. So this is part of that process of really pinning down where things are from and how far their spread has reached. So let's look at the other one, bias cut plaid. And anybody who was around about 10 or 12 years ago on the East Coast knows that the bias cut plaid coat hardie went to an enormous trend moment. This is what it looks like for men. And the assumption is that it is bias cut because all of the plaid is set on a diagonal. And from what I understand from weavers, that would be difficult at best to attain with medieval weaving technology. I can tell you, I have made a bias cut plaid coat for a woman, and it almost requires you to have some sort of supportive garment on under it, because the bias cut side will stretch out like nobody's business. So in this case with the men, the garment that they're wearing is a doublet that would be worn over something called a jubon or a jupon, an under doublet, basically, that would be very tight and would be the more padded fashion silhouette creating layer. It would be, you know, if you look at the gentleman on the left, he's a young man, it would nip in the waist and pad out the chest a bit, bulk out the arms a little bit, and then you put this skimming bias cut garment over it, and you don't have to worry about the fabric not giving you a shape of any kind. But you also see them looser, and sometimes you see them party colored, like this one in the center, which is bias cut plaid on one side and then a plain cloth on the other. The one in the middle has sort of an integral standing collar that's very tight to the neck. And then on the far right, we've got all plaid, with the little skirting to the coat that is largely a leftover from the 13th century fashions. In fact, this is probably, if following the trends from the rest of Spain, it may be laced up under the arm, following the fashion for men and women in the 13th century called saya encordada, or a laced saya, that was actually designed to show, it would show part of the chemise that would be embroidered underneath the arm. So that's some look at some men, and you do see it largely on men in the images. Now, we don't have a lot of them. The pictures here are pretty much all I've been able to find, and there's maybe 5 different paintings with all of these depictions. So on the left, you can see that extra tight, extra short, which we'll get to in short, tight, and pointy in that section. On the far right is a looser garment, and then at the top is the only one that I could find of women, and it appears to be a multicolored bias cut plaid. So the checks are in blue and red and yellow, which is not entirely standard. Often you'd find plaids in 2 colors and 2 colors only. But hers are either short sleeved or she's got her sleeves rolled up for work. She's probably wearing them under some sort of supportive garment, although you can tell not enormously supportive. At this time period across most of Iberia, you don't get the very exaggerated fit that we see sometimes in like French artwork or in some modern reenactors. The look tends to be a little more modest, and in fact, as things go, her neckline's cut very low for Spanish at this time. They tended to be more of a boat neck. So I'm not sure if this was just a passing trend. I'm going to sit down. My next step is to sit down and start looking at the year spread, and then start hunting for any others. So I am tempted to say it was probably a fashion trend that came and went pretty quickly. Doesn't seem to have gotten a lot of traction outside of Catalonia. The next one is another one of my favorites, and it's one that did get a lot of traction, not just outside of Catalonia, but outside of Spain, and that's the verdugado. You may recognize this word because in English it becomes farthingale. The legend is that it was brought to Western Europe by Catherine of Aragon, but the major difference is that in Spain, these were on the outside of the dress. The verdugas, or the canes in hoops, were intended to be seen. So you might have a situation where on the far right, the woman is lifting her skirt so that you can see the verdugado underneath, or it may be part of the full gown, as in the other 2 spaces. Most people who are paying attention will notice that the large majority of the Catalan images that I'm showing are images of Salome with the head of John the Baptist. Medieval Iberian clerics who wrote manners books for women had a real problem with verdugados and with the fake hair, those long braid cases down the back. They were very, very set against artifice. They saw it as very much akin to the activity of minor demons who were trying to trick and tempt men with false beauty. So the verdugados sent them into an absolute tizzy of hatred and writing, which is really how we know that these were actual extant garments, is because rarely are laws made prohibiting something that isn't already being done. So if they did not have them in real life, it's unlikely that we would be writing pamphlets against them. You can see on the far left, sometimes they would be coupled with this V-necked bodice where you can see the embroidered camisa or chemise underneath. And the long stripes, for anyone who's not familiar with Spanish, are referred to as tirazas. And that is taken from the Moorish tiraz, which was both a word for an embroidered band that you often see around men's garments up here that would carry specific blessings or prayers. As a matter of fact, my former Laurel's husband had a pair of tirazas that she embroidered that read, "May he see long life protected by God behind lance and shield." So that was his fighting tunic. And that was the sort of spirit that you would see. But tiras also means a particular type of silk workshop that was popular in Andalusia in the 9th century. So those names have sort of carried down and been held over. You can see that, as usual, the sleeves come in a variety of different configurations. But the thought is most of these dresses look like they were probably either plush wool or some kind of velvet or this heavy brocade. I have made one of these out of brocade dress with velvet ribbon as the casings. We're not entirely sure, or there's not an entirely consistent pattern of what these verdugos would have been made out of. Some people say cane. I believe that Hillary is actually in the class, and she has taken photos of a surviving verdugado gown that is sort of split open that looks like it may have rope inside the cords. I'll give you guys a chance to ask her questions afterwards. She's a great resource as well. And here are some that may be sort of earlier versions, softer versions. The one on the right is from a portrait of Isabella I, and you can see how the verdugos kind of ripple, which kind of indicates that they may have been of a softer material. And then on the far left, this is from the image previously. This one of the attendants to the Virgin Mary. Well, this is an attendant who's tucked off in the corner who's actually probably supposed to be either Moorish or a Mozarab woman who is in service to the queen, but she also looks like she may have some sort of rope padded skirt underneath her aljuba, her outer tunic. And then in the center is a whole other style. You see our Salome again approaching her parents. And you can see some of the overgowns that would go with the verdugado, these split paneled skirts and the very long camisa sleeves, again, indicating sort of wealth and power. And then the last little bit that we'll look at before we stop recording and go to discussion is this fashion that I'm just I mentally categorize it as short, tight, and pointy. And it's largely men's clothing. I've identified these previously as like the young man's fashion, and it seems to be primarily younger men that you see it on, but it's these extremely tightly fitted coats that are very short. They barely cover, if cover at all, either split hose or braise. This was often referred to in Europe as the Catalan fashion. And at the same time, they've adopted elements from German. So I've traced back the positioning of the belts on all of these. And that was more of a 14th century German fashion that the Spanish picked up from Germany. But as I said, everything's very short, it's very tight, and the pointy is just like their shoes were very pointy. If you look over to the right, they've got the very long toes. So this is definitely high fashion. This is a very high fashion look. For the folks who got to see Their Majesty's Twelfth Night clothing, His Majesty's coat was loosely based off of fashions like this, with a slightly longer cut, for his more august social position. Okay, so that is the beginning of my pokings around into Catalan fashion. My website is SpanishSeamstress.com. My email is beatricealvarez@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook. You'll find me around. I'm here in the kingdom. What I'm going to do now is stop the recording, and then I will stop the